I feel sad because a politician who does not know that the ultimate responsibility is accounting to people. I mean, look at what price the U.S. Health Secretary is going through about use of public resources. But how many of you last saw a governor on a flight going anywhere? Everybody's flying around in private jets. We have National Assembly. We're not quite sure whether it's small or big, but we're not sure how much of our resources go. Now, politicians should be the ones that do the most to hold others accountable. But because political parties are not functional, because civil society is not as strong as it should be, these issues are not entering public conversation, and they become problems that we must deal with. I think that today, what we must begin to focus on is how a crush culture of honest public conversation has made it easy to deny the people their role and made an integrity deficit system one that has become a hallmark of national character. We must begin to say and ask questions. How come we can't deal with issues that have been thrown up in this way? So, a few things are baffled about the nature of our system. For example, the puzzle of mindless corruption. I mean, I think most Nigerians have, I don't know, a bigger buffer for taking these things. I sometimes read the headlines and I ban people from showing me a newspaper for days. Is it possible that somebody can actually take that kind of money out of, well, is it a psychiatric problem? No. I really need to, is it a psychiatric problem? Okay, anybody who does that to a system, possibly it's a psychiatric problem, I don't know. Is this system-induced greed? Maybe it is. Or is it just that the way we see life, this zero-sum mindset, that if somebody gets, I lose, leads to a culture in which just take everything so that nobody else will get something. Because if they get something, it means I'm losing something. These all come down to the challenge of leadership. So how do we lead in this kind? I thought, I said to Osage just before he began to speak, Osage, remind me, did Peter Eke teach you? He said, yes, of course. As an undergraduate, supervised his master's thesis and even his PhD thesis. There was a time when political science in Nigeria made a huge contribution to global thinking, thesis in political science as civic culture from the work of a University of Ibadan professor who, again, one of the tragedies of Nigeria, has not been living in Nigeria for more than a quarter of a century. His name is Peter Eke. Now, Peter Eke, many years ago, wrote a seminar article on civic culture, which was generally known as the two publics, in which Peter Eke showed how a Nigerian at the level of his, say, village association meeting will not dare tamper with the fund, but at the level of the federal government can take away everything that is there and go to his village and be celebrated. In the sense that the civic cultures in which we are playing are such that the levels of both commitment, accountability, and all of that are different in these areas. And what can take care of this? Obviously, it is the terrain of leadership to build ownership. Now, part of all of this is that we have created a society that the world watches and is sometimes amazed by. Several years ago, two economists from Colombia, Javier Salai Martin and Arvind Subramanian, wrote a very tendentious piece, at least it seemed, hyperbole of some significance, in which they argued that the government of Nigeria was fundamentally so incompetent that it was best if Nigeria didn't have a government. That if you just wrote a check, took oil receipts, and wrote a check to every Nigerian to the amount, the general welfare function of Nigerians will increase dramatically over the fact that there is a government administering the receipt of these monies. Now, of course, as a patriot, I was first very angry about it. Then I began to reflect more and more on this IMF working paper in 2003, I think it was. And the truth be told, in many oil-producing states or countries, an understanding of the effect is such that a certain month in the year, you get receipts from the government of a certain amount of money. It's done in Alaska, for example. It's done in the province of Alberta in Canada. And people get their receipts from oil money because people can probably more intelligently spend their money than somebody who is detached, you know, in this civic culture that Peter Eke describes and is there in Abuja, is using that same resource. Well, an interesting version of that came from an economist, a Norwegian economist. By the way, you know, Norwegians have been some of the best at managing the so-called resource curse. A Norwegian economist at Harvard at the time called Martin Sambu. He and I met up at a conference somewhere in Europe, and he had a modified version of it. He says, you know, what we should do is not necessarily send out the receipts for, because that's not practical, it's not. What we should do is write to every Nigerian and say, today the Nigerian government earned X billion. Your portion of it is Y $100,000 or whatever. But we have chosen to tax you at the rate of 99.99%. So here is your $100. The rest of it we have kept back as tax. Martin Sambu argues that that will have what he calls an endowment effect. That the people will know that this is actually their money that is being spent. That governor that has just passed the 30-car motorcade, including 2 ambulances, that is just wasting my money. And they will demand an accountability, you understand, accounting. I said to Martin, look, okay, let's stop this conversation. You will come to Nigeria. I flew him in and put him on Patito's gang to discuss this subject in 2005, I think it was. Martin Sambu is now actually one of the editors of the Financial Times. The point to make is that only an active citizenry can keep an elite that has lost its sense of mission from going further astray. That is the only thing that can save a people. And there are examples. I mean, one of the things that I fear, or I hear all the time, why foreign investors, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. As much as we like to gloss over these things, we all have seen the PwC report. Investors frightened to come to Nigeria. Even by African standards, with the size of our economy and all the possibilities, Nigeria is receiving far less investments than much smaller African countries because investors fear Nigeria. What are the reasons that investors fear Nigeria? Because the truth be told, in this federal arrangement where there's little consequence, a person makes a decision based on a sense of personal power, and those choices are debilitating of the environment. Nigeria is considered a terrible country for regulatory risk. Anybody who has power acts in a way, as a regulator, for example, that can do more damage to this economy than the worst enemy of the country can do, but is acting in a particular kind of interest. I was at Wharton some years ago, after some kind of major reform had taken place in Nigeria, and a major consultant from one of the major consulting firms was speaking, and he says, you know, I have never seen a country wake up one morning, load a machine gun, and shoot itself in the foot. Nigeria just woke up one day and halved the value of its financial system. Those kinds of things happen because of this challenge in a federal arrangement in which power is used with very limited check. So we have a high level of, if you will, regulatory risk and such risks. And federalism is about containing those kinds of powers, about not letting one individual act with such limited checks unbalances that they can, without meaning to be really so willfully damaging, do so much damage. And that happens consistently in Nigeria because the systems are weak, the institutions are weak. How do we deal with this?